Stand atop the hill complex at Great Zimbabwe today, and you can trace your hand along granite blocks fitted without mortar, perfectly coursed, still standing after 7 centuries. More than 18,000 tourists visit these ruins each year, making them the most visited ancient site in southern Africa. But rewind 600 years, and you would have found 20,000 people living within these walls, stone towers reaching 10 meters high, gold trade routes stretching to Kilwa and Sofala, a civilization controlling an empire larger than medieval England. Conquest. Denial. Abandonment. Silence. Using cutting-edge AI reconstruction, we are about to walk you through every century of Great Zimbabwe's story, from the first Shona settlers on this granite hill to the ruins that became a symbol of African resistance and reclaimed identity. The Zimbabwe Plateau has been home to Bantu-speaking peoples since the 4th century CE, but Great Zimbabwe itself was founded around 1100 by Shona-speaking communities who recognized the strategic value of this particular hill. The site sits in a region of natural granite copies, weathered outcrops that provided both building material and defensive advantage. Early inhabitants practiced mixed farming, cultivating sorghum and millet while herding cattle that would become the economic foundation of everything that followed. Cattle were wealth. Cattle were bride price. Cattle were power. By the mid-12th century, the settlement had grown into a substantial town. Archaeological evidence from the hill complex, the oldest part of the site, shows dry stone walling techniques emerging around 1200, built by masons who understood how to exploit the natural cleavage planes of the local granite. These stones split into flat blocks, stackable without mortar, interlocking through careful placement and the sheer weight of courses laid above. The hill complex itself crowned the steepest copy, a natural fortress that became the ritual and political heart of the settlement. Here, the ruling elite performed ceremonies tied to Mori, the Shona high god, and to ancestor spirits who legitimized their authority. Soapstone bird sculptures, unique to Great Zimbabwe, were carved and placed on platforms overlooking the valley below. These birds, stylized raptors with human features, likely represented royal ancestors or messengers between the earthly and spiritual realms. By 1250, Great Zimbabwe was no longer just a hilltop settlement. It was becoming a capital. Between 1250 and 1350, Great Zimbabwe exploded into an imperial metropolis fueled by one commodity, gold. The plateau sat at the center of a vast gold-bearing region stretching across what is now central Zimbabwe, and Shona miners extracted ore from shallow reefs and alluvial deposits using iron tools and fire-setting techniques. This gold flowed north and east to the Swahili coast, where merchants from Kilwa, Sofala, and other Indian Ocean ports traded glass beads, Chinese celadon, Persian ceramics, and Indian textiles in exchange. Archaeology has recovered these trade goods in abundance at Great Zimbabwe, more than 1,000 glass beads per excavation level, along with fragments of Ming dynasty porcelain and Syrian glassware. The ruling dynasty, whose name we do not know, as the Shona oral tradition does not preserve individual king lists from this period, controlled this trade through a combination of tributary networks and direct oversight of mining and smelting operations. Chiefs across the plateau sent tribute to Great Zimbabwe in the form of gold, ivory, cattle, and grain. In return, they received exotic prestige goods that legitimized their own local authority. This was a hub-and-spoke empire, with Great Zimbabwe as the axle. The Great Enclosure was constructed during this golden age, likely between 1250 and 1300. It remains the largest ancient structure south of the Sahara, an elliptical dry stone wall enclosing nearly 8,000 square meters, with outer walls 11 meters high and 5 meters thick at the base. Inside stood a conical tower, solid granite masonry, 9 meters tall, its purpose still debated, ritual, phallic symbol, grain storage, or simply a demonstration of engineering mastery. More than 900,000 granite blocks were used in the Great Enclosure alone. No mortar. No scaffolding marks. Just stone on stone, laid by masons whose knowledge passed from master to apprentice across generations. At its height, the city supported a population estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 people, spread across the hill complex, the Great Enclosure, and the valley ruins where commoners lived in dogger, mud and thatch, houses that have long since dissolved back into the earth. By the 14th century, Great Zimbabwe was the seat of the Mambo, the Shona title for king, who ruled an empire stretching from the Limpopo River in the south to the Zambezi in the north, and from the Kalahari Fringe in the west to the coastal lowlands in the east. The Mambo's power rested on three pillars: control of gold and ivory trade, a centralized tributary system, and spiritual authority derived from the Maori cult and royal ancestor veneration. The stone enclosures at Great Zimbabwe were not fortifications in the military sense. Their walls lacked battlements, firing slits, or defensive gates. Instead, they were architectural declarations of permanence and prestige, distinguishing the sacred and royal spaces from the common. Only the elite lived within the stone walls. Commoners built their homes in the valley below, clustered near cattle kraals and agricultural fields that sprawled across the plateau for kilometers. Daily life in 14th century Great Zimbabwe was stratified but interdependent. Archaeologists have excavated evidence of specialized craft production, iron smelting furnaces, goldsmithing workshops, potters' kilns producing decorated ceramics in the Muzanjizi tradition. Women ground sorghum and millet on stone querns, brewed grain beer for ritual and daily consumption, and maintained dogger granaries plastered with termite clay. Men herded cattle, the ultimate measure of wealth and social standing, and participated in tributary networks that linked every village on the plateau to the capital. Cattle were slaughtered for royal feasts and ancestor ceremonies, their bones piling up in midden deposits that modern excavators have uncovered by the ton. Religious life centered on the hill complex, where the Mambo and ritual specialists conducted ceremonies invoking Wari and the royal ancestors. Soapstone birds stood on monoliths overlooking the valley, silent witnesses to sacrifices and divinations. The Zimbabwe tradition, as archaeologists term this culture, expressed itself not just in stone walls but in pottery styles, architectural forms, and a shared material culture that spread across the plateau as Great Zimbabwe's influence radiated outward. Tribute caravans arrived regularly, carrying gold dust wrapped in bark cloth, elephant tusks bound with leather thongs, copper ingots from the northern mines, and grain surpluses from vassal chiefs. In return, the Mambo redistributed exotic imports, glass beads in cobalt blue and emerald green, bronze bracelets, seashells from the coast, Chinese porcelain bowls reserved for elite feasting. This was not a coinage economy but a prestige goods economy, where value was measured in cattle, and power was demonstrated through the ability to acquire and redistribute rare objects from distant lands. The city's peak population, some scholars estimate as many as 20,000, others more conservatively 10 to 15,000, made it one of the largest settlements in sub-Saharan Africa at the time, comparable in scale to the Swahili city-states of the coast or the urban centers of the West African Sahel. Sometime in the early 15th century, Great Zimbabwe began to empty. The decline was gradual, not catastrophic, no evidence of invasion, no burn layers, no mass graves. Instead, the archaeological record shows a slow demographic exodus that left the Great Stone Wall standing but abandoned. Why the city fell is a question that has generated a century of scholarly debate and no definitive answer, but the most plausible explanations point to environmental and economic pressures. The Zimbabwe Plateau's soils are poor, and supporting a large urban population through subsistence agriculture required constant expansion of fields and grazing land. After 3 centuries of intensive occupation, the land around Great Zimbabwe may have become exhausted. Deforestation for fuel and construction, overgrazing by cattle herds numbering in the tens of thousands, and soil erosion would have made it progressively harder to feed the city. Add to this the depletion of local gold sources, the shallow reefs near Great Zimbabwe were finite, and as miners exhausted them, the economic rationale for maintaining a capital here weakened. Meanwhile, new trade routes and new power centers were emerging to the north. By the 1420s, the Mutapa dynasty had established itself in the Zambezi Valley, closer to untapped gold fields and the northern trade routes to the coast. The Mutapa, whose title means a master pillager or conqueror, may have been a successor state or a rival lineage, but in either case, they inherited the tributary networks and trade connections that had once flowed to Great Zimbabwe. The Mambo's authority fractured. Vassal chiefs stopped sending tribute. merchants redirected their caravans to new centers. By 1450, the hill complex was deserted. The great enclosure stood silent. Grass grew between the granite blocks. The population did not vanish. Shona communities continued to live across the plateau, in smaller settlements, maintaining cattle culture and dry stone building traditions at a reduced scale. But the city itself, the stone heart of the empire, was left to the wind and the rain and the slow encroachment of vegetation. For centuries, Great Zimbabwe remained known to local Shona peoples, who continued to venerate it as the dwelling place of ancestors and spirits. But to the wider world, to the merchants of the coast, to the Portuguese who arrived in the 16th century, to the European geographers who drew maps of the interior, it became a lost city, a name whispered in rumor but never reached. Portuguese traders probing inland from Sofala in the early 16th century heard reports of stone ruins in the interior, ruins the coastal Swahili attributed to the ancient kingdom of the Monomotapa, a corrupted rendering of Mutapa. But they never reached Great Zimbabwe itself. The site remained isolated, protected by the Tsetse Fly Belt and the Shona kingdoms that controlled access to the interior. It was not until the late 19th century, during the European scramble for Africa, that Great Zimbabwe entered colonial consciousness. In 1871, German explorer Karl Marx reached the ruins and immediately imposed a racist framework that would poison discourse for generations. Marx declared the structures too sophisticated to have been built by Africans and theorized they were the work of Phoenicians, Sabaeans, or the biblical Queen of Sheba. This fantasy, that Great Zimbabwe was a lost colony of the ancient Near East, was eagerly adopted by Cecil Rhodes and the British South Africa Company, who used it to legitimize colonial occupation of the region they named Rhodesia. The lie was encoded in official colonial literature, museum exhibits, and school curricula. African builders were written out of their own history. When archaeologists like David Randall McIvor and Gertrude Cotton Thompson excavated the site in the early 20th century and conclusively demonstrated that Great Zimbabwe was a medieval African civilization built by the ancestors of the Shona people, the Rhodesian government suppressed their findings. Cotton Thompson's 1929 report stated unequivocally that the ruins were unquestionably African in every detail, but the colonial regime continued to promote the Phoenician myth. Books supporting the African origin of Great Zimbabwe were banned in Rhodesia until the 1980s. Tour guides at the site were forbidden from attributing the construction to Bantu peoples. Archaeologists who insisted on the truth were denied research permits. This was not simply ignorance, it was deliberate erasure, a colonial project that required the denial of African architectural and political achievement to justify European rule. The Zimbabwe African National Union adopted the site's name and the soapstone bird as national symbols during the liberation struggle of the 1960s and 1970s. Great Zimbabwe became a rallying point for African identity and resistance. When Rhodesia became Zimbabwe in 1980, the soapstone bird was placed on the new nation's flag. The ruins, so long weaponized to deny African history, were reclaimed as proof of it. Since independence, Great Zimbabwe has been the subject of intensive archaeological research free from colonial censorship. Excavations by Zimbabwean and international teams have revealed a complex, stratified urban society with sophisticated trade networks, specialized craft production, and monumental architecture entirely consistent with indigenous Shona culture. Radiocarbon dating has firmly established the site's chronology: first occupation around 1100, peak between 1250 and 1450, abandonment by 1500. The soapstone birds, once looted and scattered to museums in Cape Town, Berlin, and London, have been partially repatriated, and replicas stand at the site where the originals once overlooked the valley. The stone walls, exposed to 5 centuries of weathering and some poorly conceived early restoration efforts, are now managed by the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe, which has implemented conservation protocols to stabilize the structures without compromising their archaeological integrity. Tourism has grown steadily. Great Zimbabwe is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a symbol of national pride. School groups visit from across southern Africa. International scholars come to study the stone coursing techniques, the trade networks, the urbanization processes that made this city possible. The site's museum displays the material culture recovered from excavations: glass beads, ceramics, iron tools, gold wire, and crucibles still stained with metal residue. And yet, despite decades of research, mysteries remain. We do not know the names of the Mambos who ruled here. We do not know the precise function of the conical tower. We do not know the full extent of the city at its peak or the exact reasons for its abandonment. Great Zimbabwe guards its secrets in stone, a civilization that built without writing, that left no chronicles, only walls and artifacts and the enduring presence of ancestors. Stand atop the hill complex at Great Zimbabwe today, and the wind moves through the granite towers just as it did when the Mambo ruled an empire of gold and cattle. Below, the great enclosure curves in perfect elliptical symmetry, its chevron pattern still crisp after 700 years. Tourists walk where tribute caravans once arrived. Archaeologists sift soil where royal feasts once left cattle bones piled deep. The stones do not speak, but they endure. They endure through centuries of abandonment. They endure through colonial lies that tried to erase the builders. They endure as proof that African civilizations built cities of stone, controlled long-distance trade, and left monuments that rival any in the medieval world. Great Zimbabwe was never lost. It was denied. And then reclaimed. A stone city that refused to die.